We're good? Thanks, man. All right. Can we get this door closed too, Alex, please? Thank you. All right. Fun stuff. Okay. Thank you guys for taking time out of your lunch. So for those that are not in, you don't need to turn the mic volume up. Just the camera is good. It's so loud. Yeah, you can turn that one down. Awesome. For those of you that are not in dev, we do these little tech talks every couple of weeks. Just internally, people talk on a topic of their choice. It's usually very dev focused. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a while, just because I had a lot of random thoughts, and this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart that I've been doing a lot of research on over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and I always try to tweak and adjust. So I just wanted to kind of compile those thoughts for my own benefit and then share with you, hopefully, for your benefit. So a little bit of agenda. I'm going to share ideas, philosophies, examples, life hacks, things that, that I've just been compiling over the last couple of weeks as I've been thinking about this presentation. And I'm not going to cover nearly all the material that I wanted to. I could go and talk about all the tools that you can use and all the little things that I do on a daily basis, but I want to talk on some of the key concepts because I think a lot of those bleed into other things. And I'm going to start with talking about core philosophies. Specific example I really want to go over is processing email, because I think that one is the one that really ties a lot of concepts together around being productive. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit more granular tactics, talk a little bit about, well, when you start going astray, what are the things that you can do to kind of bring you back, and then just close off with some final thoughts, all right? So a little bit of a disclaimer. I want you guys to understand that there's no right way to be productive, right? I've been evolving my workflows constantly for the last 5 or 6 years as my role has changed, as technologies have changed, as the people around me have changed, as my environment has changed. And that's something that you guys need to realize as well, that it's ultimately more about awareness and understanding how you get shit done and understanding your workflows as opposed to picking the best one. Because once you understand it, you can act consistently and appropriately to when things come up, and then you can tweak and adjust when you need to. So that awareness and that definitive, yes, this is my workflow, is where you want to try to get to first if you feel like your mind is kind of all over the place. And I know that, for example, Michelle, if she's in the room, where are you? She's very much in control of her space and what's around her, and I'm sure she follows zero inbox. I can just tell by looking at her. And then there's Sonara on the opposite end, which probably, completely ignores emails. But the thing is that they do what works for them, right? And there's probably an element on both sides that is correct for their personalities and for their types of work. You guys, most of you in the room are developers. A large part of your work is creative work. You need time to disconnect. You need time to just focus on the problem as opposed to being more task-oriented or more reactive. Like a CS, when emails come in, you got to respond right away. So your workflow is going to be very different as a developer than as somebody in CS or somebody in finance, right? So you need to have that understanding of what is your workflow and what's appropriate for my job and what I do day to day. So just a disclaimer there. So if you guys have your smartphones, can everybody just take a second and just email me? Just anything, any subject, anybody. We need a bunch of email in my inbox for later on in the presentation to actually go through and process. So let's take 30 seconds. Yeah, work email, Zak, Z-A-K @achievers.com. Just send me a bunch of junk. If you want to make it, emotional or important, then go ahead and do that. But that would be amazing. So 30 seconds. $20 seconds. Done? Okay. All right, let's move on. So Act 1, core philosophies and strategies. So why do we do this? Why do we care? Why do we care about being productive? Why do we care about defining systems and getting shit done? And you can read a lot of the stuff online. You can come up with your own brainstorming. I really think it comes down to two things. One is time is on your side. You want more time to relax. You want more time to do the things that you need to do. You want clarity. You want less stress in your mind, right? You want control around you. A good litmus test that Tim Ferriss, I'm going to talk about this author a little bit later, was how do you feel when you wake up in the morning and how do you feel when you go to bed at night on a scale of 1 to 10? Usually those two things alone are a good enough litmus test to tell you how you're feeling and how much control you have. What I always tell people when I'm kind of talking to them is, do you feel like kind of life is throwing you around, or do you feel like you're kind of controlling and dictating your life? It's really that one side or the other. And I think that that element of control is the one thing that people are really trying to find, right? So this is something to kind of move you in that direction. And the other one is around effectiveness, right? We want to be proud of what we do. We want to get more shit done. We want career progression. We want to be valuable, right? So it's really those two camps that I think are the drivers behind why we want to do this stuff. So some of the inspiration, some of you, how many of you have read David Allen's book, Getting Things Done? All right, how many of you read Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Workweek? So GTD is like the Bible to getting shit done. It is the ultimate workflow definition. It was the first, I would say, real crack at defining how it is, what workflows you should follow. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. But David is kind of at one extreme around processing everything and just kind of being very, very diligent. Tim Ferriss is like, follows a lot of that kind of philosophies, but he's also, talks about selective ignorance, which I'll talk a little bit about later too. But they do have extreme philosophies on both sides, and I've kind of taken bits and pieces from both of them, and they've both been huge inspirations on my life. And I want to share some of the philosophies in a bit, but a lot of credit goes to these two authors. All right. So I'm going to tell you a story. I was at age of 21 the other day, eating some pho, and Sean was beside me. He's not here in the room right now. So I was actually getting, the ticket where you actually write down your order, right? It was a big table, about 8 of us. And he noticed I was doing something. People were telling me orders, what they wanted, and in that quantity column, as they told me what they wanted, I would write, what their order was. In the quantity column, I put a little dot indicating that one person wanted that order. And if a second person wanted it, I put another dot beside it. And everybody gave me their order at the very end. I just counted the dots, and I put the quantities of all the items that were ordered. And he looked at me, and he's like, Zach, you have a system for everything. It's scary. And I was like, yeah, I guess I do. And the reason is actually a lot of things. It's not only about having a system for everything, it's about having a system for things that are important, because I'm kind of lazy. The second point there is you don't want to think about things too much, right? You want to focus your mind on things that are actually important, not things that are useless and that distributed cognition or just a fancy way of writing things down can solve, right? David Allen talks a lot about the concept of having a mind like water, which is very much kind of a martial art philosophy, right? So if you think of some water, water always reacts appropriately when you throw a rock at it, right? If you throw a rock softly, it ripples softly. If you throw a rock hard at the water, it splashes and it reacts appropriately, and once the splash is done, it goes back to calmness. You react appropriately for the situation, but also at the same time, the water's not sitting there, oh my God, the rock is coming, right? So there's this element of just acting appropriately and predictively and correctly for every situation that he kind of preaches a lot, and I think a lot of that kind of goes into productivity flows. One of the things that is one of the most important, and I think this often gets lost, is trust. When you have systems in place, like this is how I get done, this is how I process email, this is how I manage my task list, whatever, this is how I put stuff in my calendar. If you don't trust what you're taking out of your head and the system you're putting it into, it's kind of useless, because if it's still taking up mental capacity, then it's not doing its job, right? If you don't have the right systems in place, if you don't trust that when you write something down, that you will actually be reminded to do that thing, that you don't have the right mechanisms in place, it's still taking up brain space and brain capacity, and that's what you want to avoid. So you want to make sure that the systems you do create are polished, and I'll talk a little bit about more examples, and that actually work, right? So trust is one of the most vital things I find, and people often forget that. It's not just about writing down a bunch of lists and actioning on things and making projects and whatever. It's really about, do you actually legitimately trust when you do something or put something down that it's going to remind you to actually get that thing done? And we'll go into more examples later. I just want to stay a little high level for a second. So one of these such philosophies is on David Allen's book, talks about the core things to workflow. Collecting things, processing things, organizing things, reviewing things, and doing things. And it really comes down to this workflow diagram. I'm not going to go too much into it, right? But read the book if you're interested. And he just talks about stuff comes in, and you have to do something with it. And the core really is around 4 Ds, right? Do it, defer it, delegate it, or delete it, right? But you have to make decisions. You have to make decisions. Stuff is coming into your world constantly from all over the place. And you have to decide right away if you're going to do it right away, if you're going to defer it, if you're going to delegate it, or if you're going to delete it or file it or put it somewhere else just for later for reference, You need to make a decision right away, because if you let it linger in that in-between state, that's when shit starts getting stressful, right? When you let the more stuff that kind of compiles in that I don't really know what I'm doing with this, that's when stress starts to kind of creep up, right? So it's really about making those decisions, and we'll talk more about the 4Ds in a little bit. One actually, the things that is in here is, the 2-minute rule, and this is one of the greatest hacks that's kind of changed my life. Stuff comes into email, whatever. If it takes 2 minutes or less, just fucking do it. Just do it. Get it out of the way, right? 2 minutes or less. Rule of thumb, litmus test. Some people worry about context switching. Like, oh my God, I'm going to have all these tasks and then context switch. Then solve that problem, right? Don't check email as regularly. Check it every 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it makes. But this 2-minute rule has completely changed my life. Comes in, it's going to take less than 2 minutes. I do it, file it, get rid of it, out of sight, out of mind. Right? Great hack. If you're diligent about this, I promise you it'll change your life. All right, so let me talk about the other camp, and Tim Ferriss camp. So Tim Ferriss talks about, selective ignorance, which is the second point there. I love that quote. Most problems solve themselves. Stop making an emergency out of everything, and cultivate selective ignorance. Right? What's hidden here is that selective ignorance is also a system. Something coming into your inbox and saying, you know what, I'm actually not going to do anything about this, put it away, is an action in itself. You're acting on it, as opposed to just sitting there and be like, maybe I'll look at it later, maybe whatever. You're actually selectively saying, I do not want to do anything about this, let other people handle it, ignore it, right? But selective ignorance, you have to choose, you have to have a system, it has to be predictable, all right? The instinct as well, as you start getting more productive and as you start kind of developing more systems to kind of get the stuff done, you want to start taking on more, right? You want to say, I'm going to do more, but it's not always about doing more, right? Sometimes it's about kind of maintaining that state and kind of finding more time for yourself. So, you got to find that balance. So saying no and selective ignorance, I find, is just as important, sometimes more important than the actual process of doing things. But again, it's about being very, very disciplined and very, very concrete about what falls into what can't. It's my take on it, at least. The Pareto principle, economists from 50, 60 years ago talked. Have anybody heard of the Pareto principle before? 80-20 rule, right? Mentioned in Tim Ferriss's book quite a bit. Mentioned that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the people. He developed the theory when he noticed that 80% of the peas in his garden were being grown by or developed by 20% of the pods. Very common rule in nature. You'll see it all the time. We did an analysis on our ACV a few years back, and it was 80% of our revenue was being generated from about 20% of our clients. Right? That kind of stuff. Understanding that there's a lot of waste in your life. A lot of things that you do that actually don't produce that much value, and cutting that stuff out. Right? And I think this kind of bleeds into it. But again, a lot of great stuff on that if you read Tim Ferriss's book. All right. So let's talk about cues. I used to blog a lot, and I once wrote a thing on kind of information overload. And I think a large part of that was cues. So we have a lot of information cues in our life, right? Things that come in, and it queues up. Think of a Facebook notification, 1, 2, 3, 4, email 1, 2, 3, 4, text messages 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want you to take a second, and I want you to think about, in your own head, or talk to the person beside you, how many information cues, digital or not, do you actually have in your life? Take a second and think about it, and see how many you can come up with. I'll give you a minute or two. All right, I'm going to stop you for a second. All right, so how many of you came up with 5 or more? 10 or more? 15 or more? Oh my gosh. All right. So you can start to see that once you actually start getting control of this and understanding, how much stuff is around you and how many information cues are out there, you start realizing that, that it's quite a bit, right? So a lot of these productivity kind of tactics are about bringing that stuff together or removing cues when they're not necessary, right? A great example that I like to use all the time was Google Reader. How many of you guys were Google Reader users when it was still around? Right, so RSS feeds, right? So why is Google Reader not around anymore? Because what? Exactly. You start, oh, I want to subscribe to all these RSS feeds, and things would start queuing up, and you'd never, ever really get around to getting that stuff read, right? And it would just queue up, queue up, queue up. And then you notice that the way people started consuming information started changing, right? Like things like Flipboard, you just go on when you're interested, and you just flip through, and then you're done. There's no concept of queues, right? You don't save things to remind me to read this later, right? Reading lists. How many of you keep a list of books that you actually want to read? Saying, I want to read this book, I want to read it. Okay, I stopped doing that. I said, it's stupid, because honestly, are you actually reading books faster than you're adding to that queue? You're not. Yeah, so you're not doing that, right? So I consciously made a decision that I'm going to stop maintaining reading, like novel reading lists, because I'm not my rate of output is definitely not even close to the rate of input. Right, so that kind of selective ignorance, understanding that you don't always need a queue or a system is important, right? And embracing a little bit of randomness in your life is sometimes a good thing, right? So it's a double-edged sword. Queues can be a really good thing. They're a central part of managing your workflows and creating lists, but then there's also the other side of the Google Reader concept, or managing book reading lists, Amazon reading lists, whatever, that I find are just not healthy in any means, because you're constantly being reminded of how unproductive you are. It's not a good thing. It's not a healthy thing. You feel shitty all the time. All right. So, summary of that act, we talked about systems, right? How systems are important. You have to create systems that allow you to act in a predictable manner, mind like water, all that kind of stuff. Selective ignorance on the other side of the camp, and then kind of just a little bit of an example of understanding cues and cues in your life, all right? So that's Act 1. All right. Let's talk about email. So how many of you feel like you're actually really good at processing email? Jason? Okay. Cool. How many feel like email just like has you by the balls? All right. Okay. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna flip to Outlook. Did you guys email me? Yeah, you did. Okay, awesome. Did somebody recognize me? Awesome. So let's not do this one. Okay. So what I want to do is talk about just processing email and some of the things. Again, going back to doing what's right for you, right? My tactics here are not going to work for a CS person, because the way they handle their email workflow is a lot more different. But maybe some of these concepts you can kind of take into account, okay? So the first thing I want to bring to your attention is that I use categories quite a bit. And the categories that I create are important, action, following up, and read and review. Okay? One little tactic that I find is if you want to bring something to the top of the list, put an @ sign or another special character in front of it, just like folders, right? Go straight to the top. It's always there. It's always at the top. You use it the most. That's the most important one. Alphabetical order in your advantage. All right? So the way I actually work is that the important stuff is stuff that I flag on a daily basis as something that I need to keep top of mind every single day. And I actually review my important queue every single morning to create what I'm going to do for the day. Right? The other stuff, the kind of action, follow-up, read, review stuff, is stuff that's not time sensitive, but something I want to kind of attack once in a while. In David Allen's book, he kind of talks about this whole concept of a tickler file, things that you want to like just tickle every month, and just maybe you want to do it, maybe you don't want to do it, whatever. I generally look at these queues like once a month, honestly. And the other stuff is the important stuff. And I've adjusted this over time, and I still adjust it to this day, right? Whatever I find my workflows, and it's kind of, we've done a lot of Kanban training recently. I kind of know my gut feel that this size of important stuff right now is kind of like my work in progress limit. Like I kind of know what the size limit is, and when I look at it every day, if it starts getting out of hand, I'm like, okay, I need to do something. But that's kind of my work in progress limit, is that important stuff. One beef that I have with Outlook is that you can't group things by conversations and then still sort by category, but that's my own personal beef. So that's categories. So let's talk about actually processing email. So as I'm kind of going through, I know Chris is a big advocate of this, but keyboard shortcuts are going to save your life, right? Understanding how to work without your mouse is one of the best hacks or one of the best productivity improvements you can do. So marking things as categories, you actually have shortcuts. So I want to make this important. I just do Control F12. It goes into my important bucket, right? I want to actually file something. I have so I have one file folder called archive. So I know a lot of people have actually created lots of folders for lots of emails that they want to file, right? I just have one folder called archive, just similar to a Gmail concept, because the searching technology within email has gotten so good, right? The indexing has gotten really good. I found that that actually works. I used to create all these folders for all these emails, and I just stopped doing that because I wasn't using them. So I want to file something. This is actually important, so Control F12. This is important. I'll action it later. This I can archive. This I can delete. This I can view boost. I can view it if I want, but I'm going to just archive it right now. Right, you can kind of go through really quickly. Yeah, I don't want this. I don't want this. I don't want this. Yeah, I'm going to archive that for later. Right? This is cool, right? But you kind of just go through this until you kind of get to 0, right? One interesting thing that I actually saw as a test or beta plugin for Gmail a while ago was everything that's unprocessed or unmarked in your inbox, this whole concept of 0 inbox, is something that hasn't been actioned on. You haven't decided what you're going to do with it yet, right? So this concept they actually took into this beta plugin was every time an email comes in, it automatically gets marked as read. So there's no concept of read versus unread email. It's basically stuff in your inbox that needs processing. And then you decide, okay, this is important, I need to keep it top of mind, I need to action on it, I need to do whatever. If you want, you can create Outlook tasks, but I don't do this because it didn't work for my workflow. But again, if it works for you, that's cool, right? Go ahead. Do I what?
For example, you have something go to your important list.
Yeah.
And then after you finish the project will done.
Archive.
Now you actually.
I actually maintain that I know that I want to maintain that important list at a certain size. This is what's working for me today, and a year from now it might change. But right now, with my current email input load, that's kind of how I manage it. And I review it every day. When I actively try to get that queue down, and then that's it. All right?
So you don't deal with it right away, you just
Well, here's the thing. So going back to that rule, if I can deal with it in 2 minutes or less, and I'm actually at my desk, I'll do it. Right? If I can't, then I'll put it as important, or I'll do it, okay, I'm going to do this later. So as in a later point in time, I'll put an action on it, or I'll just file it and say I'm not going to do anything about this.
How many times a day do you check email?
Yeah, so that's one thing I'm playing with right now. So one thing I'll talk about later in terms of notifications, I actually turn off pop-up notifications and actually have my own cadence for checking email. So right now it's about it could be 20 minutes or so. Sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes an hour if I'm actually focusing on something. But as a developer or being in dev, you have that luxury of not having to be as responsive on email. When your CS is a little bit different, so you got to pick the cadence that's right for you. But yeah, I would highly suggest turning off notifications and sounds and all that shit, and just kind of establish your own cadence for checking email and just get it to 0. Go back and focus on what you need to focus on. I spend a lot of time on Outlook, and I'll talk about rescue time a little bit later too. But I don't know. I would say about a few hours a day I spend on Outlook, writing emails and all that kind of stuff. No, I haven't.
It's, I remember reading an article back from a while ago. It's basically like a process to try to get your inbox to 0. So
Okay.
It's kind of game.
What is it called?
Maelstrom.
Maelstrom? Cool. No, I haven't heard of it. A couple other little hacks really quickly that I find is really important. I'm going to talk about calendars in a second, but most people don't know you can turn an email into a calendar meeting very quickly, just dragging it to your calendar and then saying what time it is, and then sometimes you get an email as confirmation for some event you signed up for, you drag it into a calendar, make an event, do that really quickly. Another tactic that I use is actually emailing yourself sometimes. So if I'm sending an expense report, and it's like a very, very expensive, or like $1,000 or something, and I want to follow up on it, I'll actually CC myself, and then I'll put it into my follow-up category, so I'll check it like in my monthly cadence type thing. Right, so emailing yourself is actually, could actually be very useful if you have that kind of stuff in your workflow. Right, just CCing yourself and then doing something with it in your, okay? So that's a little bit on email. I have a lot more other stuff to talk about, but I have on email, but I can, do that with you in person if you're interested at any point in time. All right. So we talked about all this stuff. Being diligent when I wanted to. Oh yeah, don't peck. So that's the other thing around, as stuff is kind of piling up, there's this concept of pecking is like you kind of filter through, all the things in your inbox that are unread. You're like, yeah, that's important. I'm going to look at that. Oh, I'm going to skip all these. Just go in order, right? Start at the bottom and just go through and then do something with it. Right? That's the kind of stuff that diligence of, yeah, I'm going to follow this process. I'm going to act appropriately every single time. It's kind of like making it a martial art. That's what's really going to help you, right? Because that act of pecking, and I do it from time to time too, especially on mobile. But when you can, try to avoid the whole, pecking at email kind of thing, and just process it cleanly. All right. And then the other one I just talked to Bobby about of not kind of checking it as it comes in, checking it on your own cadence, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever works for you. All right. So this is a snapshot of a calendar from a few weeks ago. That was a nuts, crazy week. But I want to talk about calendars because I think it's actually one of the greatest things that we have available to us and still so heavily underutilized. Right? So how many of you maintain more than one calendar in your life? Okay. My recommendation would be to stop. Now, if you have one view that consolidates all of them, okay, that's okay. But like for me, like again, just talking about information queues and writing them down, calendars are also kind of like an information queue. You want to reduce and consolidate, right? I have one calendar. Some people believe in this, some people don't. I'm currently in the camp of not really. The work-life balance is kind of a myth. You just have stuff to do and you prioritize and you figure out what's important for you. I'm kind of in that camp right now. So I don't have to go, this is my work calendar, this is my personal calendar. It's one calendar, this is my life. I prioritize and I control and I do the things that I want to do. Right. That's my view on calendars right now. But the trust thing is really important, right? Of, you have to get to a point where you actually follow your calendar and you do the things that are actually in it to the point where you trust that if you put something in there, you're going to act on it appropriately. An example I have there as a haircut, just to remind myself, is that, when I get my haircut, as an example, when I leave, I actually, as I'm walking out the door, I'm like, oh, book my next one for 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, whatever. So I'm never, ever, ever look in the mirror and be like, oh yeah, I need a haircut. That whole thing has been removed from my life. It's literally, that's one example of it, of just get shit out of your head, put it into a system that you trust, and don't think about it anymore. Like you have so many more important things to think about in your life, right? So think about these things. The haircut's a small example, but there's so many other things in your life that you could follow that same approach of like, just book it and put it in your calendar and don't think about it anymore. Right? You have work to do. You have important stuff to do. You have families that you want to spend time with. Right? Get that shit out of your head. Put it into a system that you trust. Right? The other one is booking time for yourself. Is I kind of find a hack. I talked to Scott about this one too. Is like, and I'll talk a little bit about in the act of kind of when going gets tough. Actually saying, yeah, these 2 hours, put it in my calendar for myself, so nobody can actually book a meeting over that. Like, you have something to work on here, and just time gets busy. 2 hours for myself. I'm going in a room. I'm just going to work. Right? It works. All right. So I talked about Outlook and calendars. Nothing to really summarize there. Any questions so far? All right. So let's talk about some more tactics. These acts will go a little bit more quickly. Out of sight, out of mind. Kind of is an overlap with things that I talked about. But when things aren't in front of you, in a fast-paced world that we live in, and they aren't kind of reachable and they aren't kind of in sight, but still categorized in some way, you'll forget about them. Some people process email by having a bunch of folders, and they put things into the folders and saying, these are the folders I'm going to do this on, this is the folder I'm going to do this on. And I stopped doing that because I actually wanted to keep it front of mind. So that's why I use the category approach, because it's still there and I still see it. It's still sectioned off and compartmentalized, but it's in front of my face. Right? So out of sight, out of mind is if you need to do something with it, make sure it's in a system that's in your face to some degree, but not distracting. Because once you put it in a cabinet or put it in a folder, it's out of sight, it's out of mind, right? You're not going to act on it. At least that's what happens for me, right? So this concept of out of sight, out of mind, and then it works the other way too, right? Actually, when you don't need to see anything anymore, get it out of your sight. File it into the archive. Put it in the garbage. Don't collect a receipt if you don't need it. Take it out of your bag, right? Just get rid of stuff that you don't need. So both sides. Keeping it in sight when you need it. Take it out of sight if you don't need it. Environmental triggers. How many of you have ever put something beside your shoe to remember it in the morning? Right? So it's actually a very cool thing, right? Like you have a system in place. You always put your shoes on every single day, right? You're never going to forget. That's a system that just works. So putting something into that system will make sure that you do it. Telling yourself or writing a note like, oh, like, you know, remember to take this, my lunch to work the next, and you just forget about it. You do that kind of stuff all the time. So use environmental triggers where you can, right? So that same concept of when it's in sight, it's in front of your mind, put it beside your shoe. There are many other cases where you can kind of bring in environmental triggers into your life. Just think about it. How many of you make lists? How many of you make lots and lots of lists? All right. It goes back to the same thing I've been saying around harping on around making a system. Your list creating mechanism, right? Make it consistent. So what's working for me right now, again, right now, maybe not 3 months from now, is I have a master list of things I need to do, and I have a daily task list. A master list of backlog of things, and then I come in, I'm like, okay, what am I going to try to do today? Here's my task list for today, and then I try to act on it. If it comes off, it comes off the master list too. 2 lists. That's actually working quite nicely right now. But again, 3 months from now, a year from now, it may not work, but right now, that's what works. And I act consistently, and I act appropriately, and I try to act like water when I can, right? So emails are also kind of a list, but again, I use them to source my task list. It's more of that important stuff I review it every single day and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Any.do, anybody use AnyDo? Task list manager? So I'm experimenting with this right now. I'm kind of going back and forth because it's still like some paper list, but it's great as a very simple, lightweight, floating, smart task list. Like you put in the stuff you want to do today, you can drag stuff around. This is what I want to do tomorrow, upcoming, and someday. Eventually, stuff will start bubbling up to the top. If you don't get stuff done today, it'll actually go down into tomorrow, and it just reminds you, and every single day it has a little notification where you can actually plan your day, and you go through task by task. Great designed app. I use it. I'm trying to kind of separate. I'm trying it right now with just personal stuff and not work stuff and trying to see how far I can take it. But I might replace my paper list completely. And it has a great Gmail plugin as well. So you can turn email into tasks very quickly.
If you're looking for a competitor for this one, to do TEUX and UX is another one that almost does the exact same thing.
There's a lot of them out there. Like, pick one. Don't pick more than one. Pick one and use it for a long time and come up with a system and act consistently. It's the only way it'll work. All right. Evernote users? Who uses Evernote? Who doesn't use Evernote? Wow. All right. So stop writing notes down on paper in meetings and stuff like that. Like, you'll never be able to find it. We have such great technology around syncing and cloud-based documents. I use Evernote for everything, especially when it comes to every meeting. Every meeting is a new Evernote, right? Just have it in there, a separate category, right? Anytime you find yourself note-taking, there's a lot of documentation around on going completely paperless. Evernote has actually been a big advocate of that. There's a lot of guys that have written books on making your life completely paperless. And Evernotes are, pardon? There you go. Well, digital ebooks. There you go. So there's a lot of information on that, right? Staying away from static document spreadsheets. I know Scott is a big advocate of this. I almost want to set up an auto reply if somebody like sends me a spreadsheet to like fill out, like in an Excel file. I want to have an auto reply saying that, are we living in 2005 or something? Like I fight it just as diligently as Scott does. If somebody sends me a static document to fill out, I'm like, no. Here's a Google Doc with that uploaded, or here's a Google form that Michelle has started to use, which is awesome, right? The technology's here. Like, stop living in the past, right? Static documents are going away, and if you haven't switched, then that's a problem. All right. Moving on. So oftentimes you'll find yourself in situations where you start straying, right? And you are not being as productive, or you have too much on your plate, or your work in progress limit has kind of gone through the roof. One thing is around distractions, right? So you want to eliminate distractions where you can. So I talked about this a bit earlier, but how many of you actually get vibrating or notifications every time you receive an email on your phone? How many of you actually have that on? Why? Does it help you? Does it actually help you to get your phone to vibrate every single time you receive an email? Yeah, so I'm much more in the camp, again, around desktop and phone, of checking at your cadence and not getting distracted every single time an email comes in. Text messages, I find, are a little bit more important. You'll get vibrations. But make a choice, right? You have control. Don't let the technology control you. Decide what's important for you, decide what's a distraction, and act on it, right? So again, I turn those things off right now. If I find that I'm checking Facebook too much, one simple hack I did was actually just remove the browser shortcut. And automatically I was checking it less. Right? So little things like that is like just understanding what's distracting to you. Have anybody used Rescue Time before? Yeah? Rescue Time is a great tool. I actually used it a few years ago when I found I was getting way out of hand, especially with Facebook usage. It actually sits on your desktop and analyzes your usage for the day and will send you a report once a week if you spent X amount of hours in Excel, X amount of hours in Outlook, X amount of hours in Facebook, whatever, and it'll actually summarize it for you. You can trend it over time. But actually just being told the number once, just once, for 1 week was enough. That's all I needed. Just to see the amount of time I was spending on Facebook was enough to make me go, what the hell am I doing? So run it for a week. I would suggest if you find yourself being very distracted and just see the results. We have the technology. Just take advantage of it. Parkinson's Law. Anybody heard of Parkinson's Law before? So Tim Ferriss talks about this in his book, but basically written by a British historian, the demand upon a resource tends to expand to match the supply of the resource. Basically, we will use the time that's allotted for us. You have 8 hours to complete a task, you will use the full 8 hours. Example, recently we were preparing for ACE, the demo, and we were so much more prepared for the ACE keynote demo than we were last year. But we still stayed up until 2 o'clock in the morning preparing because we had the time. Because we had the time. Right? You will stretch to the time that you have. How many of you had a day to finish an essay and you just found a way to finish it? Right? And then if you had 3 weeks, you'd somehow find a way to spread it across 3 weeks, right? So understanding this and actually, again, booking a certain amount of time in your calendar or finding ways to time box yourself for certain activities when the going gets tough, I found is a tactic that I use too. If too many things to do, okay, I'm going to spend 1 hour on this. I don't care how much I get done. I'm going to spend 1 hour on it. I'm going to try to get it done. 2 hours as opposed to trying to focus on the quality, because sometimes, the quality is kind of self-imposed, right? You'll stretch things over time when they don't need to be stretched. And one of my managers used to tell me that great is the enemy of good enough. We used to read Good to Great as a company like Bible, and it was all about, oh, good to great, take everything to great. And then he was like, sometimes you have to realize that great is the enemy of good enough. You have to find that balance for yourself. All right, final thoughts. Coming to a close. Burnout is very, very real, people. Some of you people that are very young, co-ops, probably haven't experienced this yet. I've experienced this a few times where your body just kind of collapses because you burned out. You have to learn how to go on vacation or disconnect properly. I had a great conversation with Chris a couple weeks ago where he wanted to disconnect for a couple of days. And it was, I'm not going to respond to email. I'm just going to check, and I'm only going to respond to the things that are important. Bullshit, right? Absolute bullshit. What I do when you want to disconnect is literally set up an auto reply saying, I am disconnecting. If you need to get a hold of me, email my personal email. Here's my personal email address. And you delete the email from your phone. Actually delete the connector or disable it. End of story. Right? That's the only way to do it, right? It's just too easy to check, right? And then you'll be surprised. Maybe one thing will make it to your personal email. Like Tim Ferriss said before, we make artificial emergencies out of everything, right? So learn how to disconnect. It's the only way to properly. And the other thing is around weekends too. Same sort of thing applies, right? Learning how to have effective weekends. 1 day of rest, I say, is a lot better than 2 half-assed days of rest. Sometimes a lot of us have to work on the weekends, right? Like we take our work with us, we love our jobs, and we find a way to do it. But I found recently that, saying that I'm going to work hard on Sunday and give myself Saturday off, as opposed to, I'm going to work for a few hours on Saturday, a few hours on Sunday, and you're just distracted for the whole weekend, right? So learning how to disconnect properly and actually being consciously making decisions about how you're going to disconnect is very important. Very, very important. Lastly, we want to create daily habits and be disciplined, right? Already talked about this for the entire thing. Understand what hours you work best. And there's a Japanese principle called Kaizen. How many of you have heard of Kaizen before? Basically means continuous improvement or always getting better, often used in lean manufacturing, Toyota production line, just around constant improvement, right? Measuring things and understanding, I'm going to constantly get better. I've been kind of mentioning it for the entire presentation is that I don't follow a single process forever. right? It's constantly evolving, constantly changing depending on my role, the people that I'm working with, the environment that I'm in, the technologies that are available. It's a constant evolution, and you have to consciously decide how you want to use your workflows and the systems that you have created. That's all. Thank you very much.